Hello out there. My name is Franklin, and I'm creating the world I want to live in, one project at a time. Since our last visit, I am so pleased to say that I appear to have pulled out of the doldrums. A bunch of my knitting projects have moved forward, including this cycling hat, adapted from a pattern originally published in the 1880s. This pattern was a gift to my Patreon patrons, and in addition to a support video about finishing the hat, over on my Patreon blog, I'm writing about how to make it in different weights and custom sizes in a series of posts. And then, it's a little warm for this, and then there is the top-down saddle shouldered sweater from Phrancko.com. You know, the one I have been talking about almost since the beginning of this channel, that one. Well, the sweater and I got back into the ring to slug it out once again. There is not a darn thing wrong with the pattern. Pattern is great. But I have been determined to make this sweater, since the last one was plain, I want to make this one not fancy exactly, but also not just totally vanilla. So I tried traveling twisted stitch, and that didn't go as I hoped. Then I hit upon that 2/2 cable motif that I'm using in the iPad cozy. More about that in a bit. And that didn't go as planned because honestly, it looked kind of feeble in fingering weight. And then I had a moment, a bad moment, where finally I just gave up, or gave in, or maybe it was both. I said to myself, forget it, this is not happening. I am going to rip back and just work the saddle and then the continuing sleeve panels as a continuous strip of garter stitch. The rest of the sweater will be in stockinette, and that's it. And I told myself, you will, in time, make peace with that. But you know what? No. I got started. I was not very far at all. And there I was, looking at these two little strips of garter stitch on the needles. And I got angry. Because garter stitch has its merits, yes, I admit. And it can be gorgeous, yes, I admit that as well. But these two little burps of garter stitch were going to grow into something swoony, a really cool sweater? No, there was no way to fool myself into believing that this meager little bit of garter stitch was going to be swoony and romantic. And I tried so hard to make it exciting. You want to see? You want to see? Okay. Watch this. Nope, not gonna work. So, back to the beginning, I went again. I dug out every one of my stitch guides, and I found a cable braid that instead of 2/2, it's all 3/3. It only crosses on the right side. And in fact, it crosses less than the iPad cozy cable. And guess what? It's working. I love it. Even though I'm still at the beginning, I am really enjoying the knitting. And the result is plenty good enough to make me a contented little bunny. So, yeah. Now, I can also report, hooray, that the cozy for my iPad mini is nearly finished. And this project has been a blast. No pattern. I'm making it up as I go along with minimal planning. And there have not, for once, been too many bumps in the road. It's just a simple knitted envelope made of two panels sewn together, each in a different colorway of the same really pretty yarn. When the knitting was finished, I wet blocked the pieces before sewing them together because that's what I always do. Now, I have heard from a lot of my students and from a surprisingly large number of knitters in general that wet blocking makes them nervous or that it seems complicated. So, how about this? I'm going to show you how I blocked these small pieces step by step, and then show you what happened after all of that to lead to the finished cozy. I almost always wet block for two reasons: to clean the fiber and to mold the piece into its proper finished shape and size. For example, we've got to deal with those ripples at the top and bottom of the cable panel. Cable panel also has a ground of reverse stockinette, which of course curls at the edges. Blocking won't eliminate the curl, but it will temper it enough to make sewing a bit more convenient. The back panel is a variation on ribbing, so it doesn't curl, but wet blocking will even out the stitches and also fluff up the yarn. When you're wet blocking, you need a receptacle that is large enough to submerge the piece completely in water, and you need to be able to leave it there in peace to soak. I'm going to use my kitchen sink. You want to clean out your receptacle completely to make sure there isn't any grease or anything else in there. It's a great excuse to finally scrape off that one stubborn piece of dried spaghetti. Then I put in the plug because, this is a sink. The temperature of the water you use will depend on the fiber content of your yarn. Get to know your fibers and how best to treat them. Now, for a lot of fibers, tepid water is good, but before you wet block anything, do your homework. Now I'm swishing gently in some mild liquid soap. I try not to make suds because they're annoying. They get in the way of seeing what's going on. There are a lot of good options for soap, by the way. Check the description for some of my favorites. Then gently place the knitting in the water and gently press down to submerge. Gentle is key in this process, especially when it's wet. Be gentle with the knitting. Now, leave it alone to soak. If there is a door you can close to keep people and animals away, close it. And don't rush the soaking. It can take an hour or more for some types of fiber to soak to the core. Meanwhile, get out a large, clean, hand-woven, 100% Egyptian cotton towel. I'm just kidding. This is an old towel that I also use for drying Rosamund after her bath. It can be any old good clean towel. Spread it out in a place where the knitting will be able to sit undisturbed to dry. After the soaking comes rinsing. Now, these fibers I used can handle a rinse right under the tap, so I'm doing that. Some fibers should be put through several changes of plain water instead. How do you know? Learn about the fiber that you've used. Get to know your fibers. And you can gently squish the excess water out, but don't wring the fabric. Now, the damp knitting is supported and carefully carried to the towel, spread out, and we begin shaping gently. I'm going to flatten out the curls at the side as much as possible, and also make sure that those ruffles that were at the top and the bottom now lie flat. This is a gradual process, and it's important, so don't rush it. Bit by bit, shape your piece. And yes, I measure with a ruler or yardstick, preferably depending upon the size. Measuring is important to make sure you end up with the proper dimensions. Your eye can and will fool you, especially when you're blocking large or complicated shapes. I just need to make sure my panels are square and the same size. And when that's done, walk away and let them dry. Like soaking, this is going to take time, probably quite a bit of time. You can move things along a bit by playing a fan across the fabric, or maybe opening a window, unless birds or squirrels might break in and run off with your work. These panels took 48 hours to dry completely. After blocking, some yarns will change dramatically and some will not. My panels now are clean, square, curl a bit less, and look and feel more like cohesive pieces of fabric, just as I hoped. So then it was time to sew. First, sew the panels together and then give them a woven fabric lining. So I started with pinning, in this case with locking ring stitch markers with the right sides of the panels facing. I always pin, and if you want to hear me talk more about it, check out my video about sewing together garter stitch. Then I do the sewing. I decided to use backstitch. That may surprise you, but I have often used it with knitting on the advice of an extremely accomplished knitter who has taught me a great deal. Backstitch is excellent where seams need to be firm and strong. With the knitting sewn together, it was time to do the lining. A lining is essential for knits intended to hold electronics because electronics and lint should never mix. I'm using one of my own fabric designs, Dotty Coneflowers, from my Spoonflower Shop. This is not a complex lining, just an envelope to go inside of an envelope, so I measured the knitting, I added seam allowances, traced everything out with a ruler and a pencil, and cut. First, I sewed a very simple, turned back and very visible hem at the top. This isn't going to show on the outside of the case, and I didn't feel like messing around with a blind hem. Then I sewed the side seams, and of course, I pressed each seam as I went along with the cute little travel steam iron I keep in the workroom. NetSuite? I'll link to it in the description. For the next steps, I'm afraid I only have two rather ugly still photos. So I turned the knitting inside out, then slipped the lining over it right side out. At the top, I attached the lining by hand, taking a small stitch first into the wrong side of the hem at the top of the lining, then a small stitch into the knitting, working slowly, gradually right to left. Then came the magic moment of turning the whole thing right side out. And I was pleased. Mostly. Because you may notice a little something extra along the right and left edges. Where my long seams were in the knitting, after all that careful backstitch, how did they look? Like this. Yuck. I have had backstitch work beautifully on other projects, but here, no. I was so disappointed that I was right on the verge of unpicking everything when suddenly I remembered Miss Florence, who taught ballroom deportment and principles of eyelash enhancement at my finishing school. Now, time and again, Miss Florence would say to us, "My dear young people, we are none of us perfect. We all of us have our flaws. And when we discover a flaw within ourselves, what do? That's right. We cover it up and pretend it isn't there." So, I took 2 strands, one of each color, of the knitting yarn, and used them double to embroider simple chain stitch right over the offending seams. I'm happy, and I think Miss Florence would be proud. The only thing left to do is create a closure with a flap and buttons. For the buttons, I'm dipping into one of my late grandmother's button tins. She was a seamstress for 80 years, so she had a lot of buttons. But I'm going to save that for the next episode. I hope you'll come back and join me, and until then, I hope you're enjoying whatever you're making. Remember, be good to yourself and be good to others. Until next time, see ya! Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel so you'll be the first to know about future episodes. Click like or leave me a comment to let me know your thoughts. And if you really, really liked what you saw, check out my Patreon campaign, where my patrons enjoy exclusive access to downloads, live streams, and other bonus material every week.